My name is Rachel Evans. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a former combat pilot for the United States Air Force. I've flown over mountain ranges and deserts, in silence and in chaos. I've watched tracer rounds light up the night sky like fireworks. I've landed aircraft in blackout zones with nothing but memory and instinct. I've trained alongside men who used to roll their eyes at the idea of a woman in the cockpit until they saw me fly. But none of that mattered to my father or to my brother. My dad said I'd never be enough. He meant it too. The words weren't shouted in anger. They were said calmly, like he was stating a fact. He told me during my commissioning ceremony when I walked off the stage and found only a stiff handshake waiting. Your uniform fits, he said. But command, that takes something you don't have. My brother thought I was just a passenger, not just on planes on life. He said I had a knack for timing, for showing up when others had done the hard work, but not the guts to lead through fire. He once laughed in front of our squadron when I got reassigned to logistics airlift support. Guess they finally found her level, he said. So when I boarded Flight 472 from Juneau to Anchorage, Seat 9A, I didn't expect recognition and I didn't want it. I wore a worn black hoodie pulled low over my face. I kept my bag under the seat and my thoughts even lower. The plane lifted off into a sky of dull gray. The kind of sky that hides turbulence like a lie hides consequence. 17 minutes into the climb, I felt it. The kind of jolt that doesn't come from bad weather. The airframe didn't bounce. It groaned. The sound came from the bones of the aircraft. The kind you only hear when pressure doesn't equalize fast enough. A sharp tug down my spine told me the pressurization system had failed to adjust to altitude shift. My fingers curled against my knees. I took a breath and counted 3 seconds. Then came the second lurch. Screams erupted in the cabin. Overhead bins clicked. A baby cried. The man next to me clawed at the armrest, muttering prayers. 2 rows ahead, a woman yelled at the flight attendant, asking what was going on. There was no answer. Then the voiceover. The intercom. If any passenger on board has flight experience, military or commercial, please alert the nearest crew member immediately. No rank, no formality, just raw urgency. I exhaled. Then I stood up. Someone behind me shouted, "Sit down." Are you crazy? A man across the aisle grabbed my arm. This isn't a movie, he hissed. I looked him in the eye. No, this is real life. I moved forward, step by step, walking toward the cockpit as the plane shook again, this time harder. Oxygen masks deployed in the back rows. The cabin lights flickered. The flight attendant, Cindy, I read her name tag, tried to block me. I gave her one look. She hesitated, then stepped aside. And then I reached it, the cockpit door. I knocked twice, not out of formality, but control. The door buzzed open, and the last thing I heard behind me was the hush of 100 people watching a stranger walk into the place no one else dared. The cockpit door closed behind me. The first thing I saw was his profile. Sharp jaw, rigid shoulders, knuckles whitening on the control yoke. My brother. Jason didn't turn immediately, but I knew the second he recognized me. He glanced toward the camera monitor, saw my face, and went still. Not shocked. Not relieved, just still. Like something in him paused before reacting. Rachel, he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to stabilize. His co-pilot looked from me to him, confused. Captain Jason didn't speak. He moved aside. I stepped in, scanned the displays. The altimeter showed 30,000 feet, but the airspeed indicators were off. One backup gauge blinked wildly. I knew that reading. It was the same warning that had triggered a systems failure in Kandahar 5 years ago. Cabin pressures failing mid-climb, I said calmly. Backup compressors overcorrecting. You're fighting the pitch. Let me help you stabilize trim and recalibrate altitude offsets. I slid into the co-pilot seat. My hands didn't shake. Outside the cockpit, the cabin trembled like lungs gasping for air. Inside, The only sounds were the soft hum of failing systems and the stuttered beeping of a pressure monitor. I reached for the trim tab switch, adjusting pitch to level flight. The plane settled. Slightly. One warning light blinked off. I checked lateral drift, just 2.6 degrees. Starboard. Correctable, manageable. Jason finally spoke. Why are you even on this flight? I took emergency leave to attend Commander Walker's funeral. I answered without looking at him. Didn't expect to find family on the manifest. His mouth tightened. I checked the radar. No. Weather front ahead, but the flight path crossed a cold jet stream that could shear the aircraft if pressure imbalance persisted. How long has the compressor been running on override? I asked. Since Juno, the co-pilot answered. Almost grateful someone knew the language he was speaking, I nodded, keyed in a soft correction. Stabilizers. Responded. The plane responded. Jason still hadn't touched the controls again. I glanced at him. This isn't about you or me. This is about getting 216 people back on the ground. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. There was a sound from beneath the console. A slow, steady knock. Not metal, not warning, just the vibration of air struggling against imbalance. It reminded me of a heartbeat. I watched the displays. Cabin pressure leveling. Turbulence dropping to mild. Engine temperature stabilizing. The beeping stopped. For the first time since takeoff, there was silence in the cockpit. I looked out the windshield at the vast sky ahead. In that moment, I felt it. Not pride, not vindication. Just steadiness. I wasn't just another passenger. Not anymore. And maybe not ever. I didn't cry at the funeral, not because I wasn't sad. I was. But sadness had a shape back then. Small, dense, silent, something I folded and tucked deep inside the pocket of my uniform, just like the letter Mom wrote me a week before she passed. I kept both close. Neither were seen. It was a closed casket service, just like she wanted. Minimal speeches, no slideshow, no weeping at the altar, just a soft instrumental hymn, and the sound of breath being held too long. I sat in the fourth row in full dress blues. The only sound I remember was the scuff of my own shoes on the church floor as I walked in alone. Jason and my father sat in the front, flanked by executives from the airline board, Air Force retirees, and people who looked like they were used to being listened to. My father didn't glance back. Jason didn't either, and I didn't expect them to. Not really. When the priest announced that the reading of the will would follow in the reception hall next door, I stood for a moment. Longer than anyone else. A part of me hoped someone might turn and wave me forward, invite me in. But no one did. The reading was private. Just family, they said. So I stood behind the frosted glass doors and waited, listening for my name. I never heard it, not once. I watched Jason exit first, holding a leather folder in his hand and a tired look on his face, like someone who had just inherited responsibility, not legacy. Behind him, my father. Stray-backed and stonied, like the ceremony had cost him energy he didn't have. Neither looked surprised, neither looked conflicted. It was clean. I slipped away before they saw me. Later that evening, I returned to the lake house, the same one we used to spend summers at when Mom was strong enough to chase dragonflies with us across the dock. Jason had always hated the quiet there. Said it felt like time had stopped in all the wrong places. I loved it. Mom did, too. Inside the small study, the air still smelled like her lavender and something faintly like lemon balm. Her favorite book was left on the side table, a ribbon still marking the page she never finished. Tucked between that page was a handwritten note addressed to me. Not in an envelope, just folded. It read, Rachel, I know what they'll say, but this house was always yours. You're the only one who ever listened to it breathe. Keep it quiet. Keep it safe. It belongs to you. There was no signature. She didn't need one. I knew her handwriting like I knew my own. That night, I lit the fireplace and sat on the wooden floor for hours, holding that note, reading it again and again, as if the ink would disappear if I looked away. I didn't challenge the will. I didn't march into their offices or demand my share. I folded the note, slid it into the front flap of my journal, and packed my things. The next morning, I left the lake house key under the stone all by the porch. The one Jason and I had painted as kids. Mine still had stars on its wings. His a crooked American flag. I didn't take a single item with me. Not a chair, not a frame, not even the sweater Mom left in the cedar closet. I just walked away. It wasn't surrender. It was subtraction. A quiet cutting away of the belief that blood alone binds us to memory. In war, you learn to disengage before the damage spreads. This felt the same. Later, when people asked why I disappeared for 3 years, I told them the truth. I wasn't running. I just didn't see a reason to stay. I didn't leave the Air Force with fanfare. There was no ceremony, no folded flag handed to me on a windless day. No handshakes, no plaque, no photographs, just a form signed, a locker emptied, and a name removed from a flight rotation board. The discharge was honorable. I didn't fail. But I didn't fight to stay either. After my mother died, and the will confirmed what I already suspected, that in my family's eyes, I had never really belonged. I didn't just leave the service. I disappeared. I filed for leave under personal transition grounds, moved out of state, and submitted an anonymous inquiry to a weather observatory near Kodiak Island. Not a glamorous job, certainly not one my father would have ever bragged about, but the kind that suited my silence. They hired me under the name Ree Howard. No one asked what the initial stood for. And I didn't offer. My role was simple. Assist with radar diagnostics and early pattern detection for civilian flights and research aircraft. I didn't wear a uniform. I didn't give orders. I calibrated equipment, monitored anomalies, and repaired signal loss in freezing conditions with gloved fingers and a flashlight in my teeth. It was quiet work, thankless but precise, and it kept my hands moving when my mind threatened to sink. I still woke up at 0500 every morning. Still tied my boots the same way. Still checked wind speed by instinct before reading the gauge. Muscle memory doesn't unlearn that easily. Discipline doesn't dissolve just because you take the uniform off. Every morning before my shift, I'd unroll a laminated map of Northern Airways, tracing flight paths with a grease pencil, tracking commercial patterns in emergency corridors. The new hires always asked why I did it manually. You know we have software for that, right? I'd nod, smile, politely, keep tracing. Because in combat, you don't rely on software when you're 2,000 foot lower than expected and the storm front moves faster than your wingman. You memorize. You feel the space between vectors like a pianist feels the space between keys. I still remembered most transponder codes by heart. Still knew which call signs came from which regional bases. And I could still pick out a deviation in heading from a 20-line printout faster than anyone else in the room. One day, a supervisor asked if I had previous military experience. I shrugged. Used to fly, I said. He didn't ask more. I appreciated that. No one called me by my full name. I didn't even hear it aloud for months at a time. I became background noise, reliable, invisible, forgotten. And for a while, that was exactly what I needed. I lived in a small rented cabin just off a frozen inlet. No internet, no neighbors. I chopped my own firewood, fixed my own generator, and boiled snow when the pipes froze. There were nights when the auroras stretched over the sky like breath on glass. And I'd sit on the porch with coffee and think, maybe this is what peace looks like. Solitude earned, not given. But solitude has a way of amplifying memory. There were days when I'd catch a call sign I recognized, one Jason had used before. Or I'd spot a flight headed for a hometown, and my chest would tighten before I reminded myself that no one there would be waiting. No one would be watching the sky for me. Still, I stayed. I stayed until the weather grew warmer and the ice around the inlet cracked like a whisper in the dark. Until I got the call about Commander Walker's memorial. My old flight leader. The only person who ever told me I was born to lead, not follow. And I knew I had to go. I booked the flight the next day. I chose my seat deliberately. I didn't use miles or discounts. Just paid full fare and picked 9A, front of the cabin, port side, closest seat to the cockpit. I told myself it was for legroom. But part of me, wondered if proximity to that door might matter one day. I didn't know how right I was. The message came in at 3:42 a.m. I hadn't been asleep. I rarely was, not fully. Something about the quiet in that cabin near the inlet always made it hard to rest. Like the silence was too wide, too deep. It echoed things I didn't want to hear. The text was short, just 2 sentences. Walker's gone. Training accident. Nellis Memorial in Anchorage this Friday. Commander Walker wasn't just another CO. He was the one who vouched for me when no one else did. The one who handed me the keys to my first C-130 and told the rest of the squadron, "She lands better in crosswind than any of you." And he meant it. He gave me my first real mission and my first real fear. And now he was gone. I didn't hesitate. I opened the airline website and looked for the next flight out of Kodiak. There was one the following morning, Flight 4722, Anchorage with a layover in Juneau. It was the only seat left in premium economy. Window row 9. I stared at the seating chart for a long moment. There were a few spots open in the back, but something pulled me forward. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was training. When you spent a decade near cockpits, you start to feel the weight of every seat's location. What you'd do if something went wrong, how fast you could move if you had to. The cursor hovered over the map. Row 9A, port side, forward. Cabin, closest to the cockpit without being in first class. I selected it. Paid full fare, no military discount, no travel points. I packed light, one duff. No uniform. I hadn't worn the blue since the day I walked away, but I folded a clean black shirt, slacks, and the thin silver pin Commander Walker once gave me when I earned my 3rd star. For flight excellence. I hadn't looked at it in 3 years. The weather was rough. That morning, wind gusts rolling in from the inlet, sleet cutting sideways across the tarmac. The airport was half empty. The check-in clerk looked tired. Probably on her 3rd double shift of the week. She asked if I wanted to be upgraded to business class. Someone had just canceled. I shook my head. No, thank you. I'll keep my seat. She looked at the screen. 9A, I nodded. She smiled. You'll be right by the cockpit. Good spot. I didn't answer. I kept my eyes down as I passed through security. Kept my head low in the waiting area. My name had changed in the system, but habits don't forget. I still scanned crowds the way I used to in field missions, looking for patterns, for disruptions, for exits. Boarding was called in 3 groups. I waited until the last minute to get in line. When I reached the threshold of the aircraft, the first thing I heard was the captain's voice. Over the intercom. It stopped me cold. It wasn't just familiar, it was personal. This is Captain Jason Evans. We'll be heading up to Anchorage with light turbulence and a projected arrival time of 2 hours, 25 minutes. Jason, my brother. I stepped onto the plane, didn't say a word. The flight attendant scanned my boarding pass and gestured forward, left side just behind the divider. I slid into 9A, stowed my bag, pulled my hoodie higher, and stared out the window. The sky outside was slate gray, heavy with cloud. The kind of sky that doesn't just hold weather, it holds warning. I fastened my seatbelt, breathed once, and told myself it didn't mean anything, just a flight, just a seat. But even then, some part of me knew. It started with a whisper. Not from a passenger, not from the crew. From the frame of the aircraft itself. A subtle metallic vibration beneath my shoes, too high-pitched to be turbulence alone. Too steady to be random. Most wouldn't have noticed it, but I'd flown long enough to know when a plane was trying to tell you something. I shifted in my seat, tightened my seatbelt by 1 notch. Across the aisle, a teenage boy laughed at something on his phone. Ahead of me, A woman adjusted her scarf and popped another mint into her mouth. The flight attendant passed with the beverage cart, smiling in that well-trained way that tells you nothing is wrong even when something is. Then came the first jolt. Not a bump, a jolt. Like the belly of the aircraft had struck something invisible. A few passengers gasped, cups tipped, someone cursed. I felt it in my spine. The pitch had shifted slightly, nose down. Not enough for the average passenger to notice, but enough for anyone with flight training to feel the difference in cabin pressure distribution. Then the second jolt hit. Stronger, sharper. The plane dipped. Not much, but fast. 2 rows ahead, a coffee cup flew into the air and landed in someone's lap. A baby began to cry. Somewhere behind me, an overhead bin popped open with a dull thud. Oxygen masks didn't deploy, but the lights flickered. I looked out the window and saw it. Just a thin stream of gray smoke trailing from the left wing. Route. Not black, not thick, but enough. Enough to know something wasn't regulating air flow the way it should. People started murmuring. Panic rippled. Like static. And then over the intercom, Jason's voice, calm, measured, practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. If there is anyone on board with aviation experience, military or civilian, please alert a flight attendant immediately. He didn't say emergency, but the fact that he said anything at all told me what I needed to know. He was losing control. I took a slow breath. Next to me, the man in the window seat clutched the armrest. His knuckles were pale. He looked over at me, eyes wide. Did he just ask for help? He whispered. I didn't answer. A woman across the aisle muttered. A pilot asking for help. That's not good. And then someone laughed, sharp, dismissive. It was a woman in a beige jacket, maybe mid-50s, with lacquered nails and a voice like a slap. She said loud enough for a few rows to hear. What? Is someone going to stand up and pretend to be a hero now? What UH? She pointed at me. You going to save the plane? There was a pause. I looked at her, not angry, not insulted, just steady. And then I stood up. The man next to me grabbed my arm. Hey, where are you going? You can't, this isn't a movie. Another voice joined in from behind. Sit down, lady. Let the crew do their job. The flight attendant, Cindy, rushed forward. She looked panicked, eyes scanning my face like she wasn't sure whether to stop me or thank me. I need to speak to the cockpit, I said. Cindy hesitated, her lips parted, closed, then parted again. You are you? Tell them 9A is requesting access. Her eyes flicked to the cockpit door, then back to me, and she nodded. The rest of the cabin buzzed in disbelief. I could feel the questions rise, taste the judgment in the air. But I didn't care. I didn't explain myself. Explaining is for people who want permission. I just moved forward, the floor trembling beneath each step. I felt every eye watching me, every breath drawn in hesitation or contempt. But I didn't look back. Just before I reached the cockpit door, I heard someone mutter low and mean. Some people just want attention. No, I didn't. I wanted altitude stability. I wanted airflow correction. I wanted 216 people to make it home. The cockpit door blinked with its tiny red light. Cindy tapped her code. The light turned green and I stepped inside. The cockpit door clicked shut behind me. The soft hiss of the seal engaged, and suddenly it was just us, me, Jason, and his co-pilot. The cabin noise faded to a hum like a distant ocean. Jason turned. His head snapped over his shoulder the moment he sensed movement, ready to command, ready to question, until he saw me. He froze. Time didn't stop. But something did. I saw the recognition break across his face like glass, hit by a low-frequency vibration, slow, silent, irreversible. His mouth parted, his eyes widened, not in panic, but disbelief. Rachel, he breathed. 3 years, no words, no letters, no calls, just distance. Uniform silence. A house with only one parent's picture still standing. And then, this, he swallowed. What are you doing here? I didn't blink. To keep 216 people alive, I said, including you. I didn't say it cruelly. No sharpness in my voice. No bitterness. Just a simple statement of fact. His co-pilot, a younger man, with sweat collecting at his brow, stared at me like I had arrived from a hallucination. His hand hovered over the control panel like it was sacred, like touching it wrong might collapse the sky. I stepped forward and knelt slightly, eyes locked on the dashboard. The airspeed indicator was twitching, not wildly, but inconsistently. There was a faint delay between input and response. That wasn't standard lag. That was faulty routing or wind differential. I scanned the horizon line on the display. Your altimeter's off by about 900 feet, I said flatly. Jason turned toward the console. What? Your pitch and yaw aren't syncing. That's why the cabin felt like it dipped before. You're 900 foot lower than your readout. I moved to the side panel, tapped into secondary diagnostics. The software recognized my military access override. Even in civilian retrofit, I didn't need permission. The system already gave it. I continued without pause. Also, your wind shear report from 30 minutes ago wasn't processed properly. Your left stabilizer is getting more drag because the crosswind pattern inverted. That's what's causing the lean. It's not structural failure. It's feedback misalignment. Jason blinked. His voice was quiet. How? How do you know that? Because I trained for it, lived through it, and because when the military pushes you out, they forget you still carry every scar and every system protocol inside your head. I looked up at him. You think combat flight doesn't teach you to read broken code under pressure? The co-pilot cleared his throat. She's right. I thought I was losing manual control. Something fell wrong. But now that she said it, Jason hesitated, then nodded once sharply. He stood and slid back his seat, motioning for me to take the auxiliary position. Not the pilot seat. Not the command chair, but the place where real problem solvers sit. The one that doesn't get credit, but keeps planes in the air. I sat down. My hands moved instinctively. I recalibrated cabin pressure distribution by 2.4%. Adjusted pitch compensation and reroute diagnostics through the backup loop Jason hadn't activated. Not his fault. He'd been trained for peace. I'd been trained for failure scenarios for war. Jason didn't speak again. He just watched. For the first time in years, I felt his silence wasn't made of shame or rivalry, but respect. Outside, the wing smoke thinned. Not gone, but less angry. Less urgent. Cabin pressure stabilized. The cabin lights stopped flickering. The plane leveled. And still, no one in the cabin knew what had just happened. But Jason knew. He reached forward, his voice low. You saved them. I didn't look at him. I was trained to do more than take orders, I said. I was trained to know when silence is deadlier than noise. He exhaled, and for a second I saw my brother. Not the pilot, not the air, not the one who got the will, just the boy I used to share a flashlight with under the blanket, imagining cockpits we'd one day fly together. The moment passed, but it stayed long enough to remind me why I was here. Jason reached forward, slow, deliberate, as if he was trying to take the controls back without making a scene. He didn't say a word, but his hand hovered close to the side panel, fingers stiff with tension, with protocol. I knew that grip. I'd held it myself in flight school, in combat drills, in blackout simulations where one wrong touch meant fire, or worse, silence. I didn't look at him. I placed my hand over the throttle adjuster and spoke evenly. I've got this. His fingers paused midair, then slowly retreated. I didn't need dominance. I needed function. The plane was still trembling. Slightly. It's an act of respect for the air, for the machine, and for physics that don't care who inherited the cockpit. I reduced vertical thrust by 2%. Trimmed the Rudder just slightly off-center and adjusted elevation to dip the nose by half a degree. It wasn't dramatic, but the trembling stopped. The plane moved smoother, more obedient. Even the air felt quieter. Jason didn't speak. He just looked down at my hands. My left rested calmly on the stabilizer dial, and my right hovered over the diagnostics pad. Both steady, both worn, with calluses from years of gloves, cables, and night flights. Not hands that had inherited anything. Hands that had built muscle through storms. His gaze lingered, specifically on my right hand, the one that had signed the withdrawal letter from Mom's will. I knew what he was thinking. Not about the will itself, but about the silence that came after. The decision to step back without noise, to disappear without complaint, but silence isn't surrender. Sometimes, silence is strategy. I leaned back slightly, the cockpit humming around us. Like a low lullaby. Jason glanced at the readings. Everything was steady. The cabin wasn't panicking anymore. The crew wasn't flailing. And outside the sky, brutal just minutes ago, looked almost gentle. You were always better at finesse, he muttered. I almost smiled, but I didn't answer. He wasn't saying it to make peace. He was saying it because now, finally, he knew it. And that was enough. I didn't need to yell to be heard. I didn't need applause to be remembered. Sometimes the loudest sound is a steady flight after the turbulence. It started with a blink of a red light, barely noticeable, nestled beneath the seat in front of me. Someone had been recording. I didn't think much of it then. I had more pressing concerns like keeping 216 live suspended safely between a faulty engine and an unforgiving sky. But once we landed, once the wheels kissed the tarmac in Anchorage and the applause broke out like a nervous ripple, I felt it. A shift, a ripple in the quiet. Someone uploaded it. The clip was only 23 seconds long. No audio, just shaky footage from a smartphone aimed down the aisle. You could see me row 9A rising from my seat as the cabin swayed. A man grabbed my wrist. I pulled away and then I walked toward the cockpit, disappearing behind the sealed door. No screaming, no chaos, no hero moment. Just quiet action. And that's what struck people. I didn't find out right away, right? I didn't even check my phone when we landed. I said nothing to the crew. I avoided the gate cameras. I slipped into a taxi, gave the address of a nearby motel, and disappeared. That was the plan until I woke up 6 hours later to 63 missed calls, dozens of texts, and a screen full of news alerts. Mystery woman takes control mid-flight. Who is she? Passenger or pilot? The video that's breaking the internet. Silent hero in row 9A. I stared at the headlines. They didn't mention my name. Not yet. Just screenshots. Pause frames of my silhouette moving up the aisle. Freeze frames of my face. Partially turned. Eyes locked forward. Mouth closed. Even without sound, they could tell something had shifted when I stood up. I turned off the phone, then removed the battery. Old habits. I closed the motel curtains, unplugged the television, and sat on the edge of the bed, knees together, hands still. But silence doesn't stop the world. It only makes it echo louder. The next morning, a knock at the door, then another. Voices. Someone saying they were with a local paper. Another claimed to be from a veterans network. They didn't use my name, but I knew it was only a matter of time. Jason hadn't called. He wouldn't. We had an unspoken pact, no contact unless it was flight or funeral. But someone had clearly leaked the manifest. And in an age where one face online equals 1,000 algorithms, anonymity became a myth. I turned the phone back on for 30 seconds, long enough to see I'd been tagged in a Facebook post from a girl I hadn't spoken to since basic training. She wrote, "Is this Rachel?" and circled my blurry frame in the video. I turned it off again. What unsettled me wasn't the fame, it was the frame. They were painting me into a story I hadn't written. People needed a heroine. They needed a woman who rose from obscurity, walked into a cockpit, and saved the day. They needed Headlines, hashtags, and hot takes. But I didn't rise to be seen. I rose because the plane needed to land. That was it. And now the noise outside was louder than the silence I had chosen. I remembered what Mom once told me when I was 16 and hiding my pilot's manual under my pillow like a diary. She said, "Don't ever fly for attention. Fly because you can't bear to crash." I couldn't stop the internet. I couldn't silence the world. But I could decide one thing. I wouldn't speak. Not yet. The truth didn't need me to shout it. The truth had already been filmed without a single word. The envelope was cream-colored, thick stock, and embossed with a law firm name I didn't recognize. I opened it without blinking. Inside, a simple letter. "We are currently reviewing secondary documents connected to the estate of Mrs. Eleanor Thorne. We've come across a potential handwritten draft that may require verification. Would you be willing to discuss it?" I knew exactly which document they meant. A week before Mom died, she had handed me an envelope quietly in her studio under the slanting afternoon light that turned the dust into falling gold. She'd said only one sentence. "Keep this in case memory isn't enough." I hadn't opened it until after the funeral. Inside was a letter. Her handwriting, firm, cursive, filled with loops and deliberate pressure. "Rachel deserves the house. Jason will understand. He has the business, the accounts, and your father's pride. Give her what's hers. You know how much that lake means to her. Love always. Mom." She had signed her full name, even dated it. No legal jargon, no witness signature. But it was something. And it was the only truth I had left. I scanned it and emailed it to the law firm, then waited. 2 days later, they called. A woman named Kendra explained that the primary will on file was typed, signed, and clean. But this letter changed the tone of the inheritance, at least ethically. It wouldn't overturn the will, but it might reopen the conversation. That was when Dad called. His voice wasn't warm. It wasn't cold either, just sharp, like a blade left out in snow. "Rachel," he said, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" I didn't answer at first. He continued, "Your mother was ill. That letter wasn't part of any formal will. You're making a mess." I could hear the rustle of papers in the background. I pictured him in his study. Mahogany desk, leather chair, the framed certificate of my brother's first solo flight still hanging proudly behind him. "Dad," I said quietly, "I'm not trying to take anything that wasn't meant for me." He scoffed. "Then don't send lawyers digging." I wanted to scream to remind him that I had stayed with Mom through the last 6 weeks, that I knew every pattern in her oxygen intake, that I had cleaned the house she was given back to her husband in a will that didn't mention her daughter once. Instead, I said, "Don't lie. Not again." Silence. Then Jason agrees. He says you shouldn't push this. I blinked. He agrees? I asked, my voice brittle. Has he even read the letter? He doesn't need to, Dad replied. We already decided what's best. I hung up. That night, I forwarded the email again to both the law firm and Jason. I included no message, just one attachment. 5 minutes later, Jason responded with a single line. I never saw this before. That was all. No apology, no defense, no taking sides, just acknowledgement. And that hurt more than any denial because it told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't known, but he hadn't asked either. The email from HR landed in my inbox at 9:04 a.m. sharp. Subject: Internal Review Committee Request for Participation. Attached was a formal notice. The airline's internal board was convening to reassess personnel conduct related to Flight 7A2. Not just technical procedure, but leadership behavior, command decisions, and internal communications during the emergency. I wasn't surprised. What did catch my breath, though, was the second paragraph. Due to submitted passenger footage and third-party statements, your presence is requested to offer a technical statement. As part of the closed review. Me, the ex-officer turned radar tech, the woman, who hadn't worn a uniform in 3 years. The name not in the will, I replied without hesitation, confirmed. Attendance. The review was held 3 days later in a bland, soundproofed meeting room inside a terminal I'd once walked through anonymously. Now I was escorted past flight crews, security, admin staff, each of them whispering just out of earshot. There were 8 people seated around the U-shaped table. My father was one of them. Jason, 2 seats to his left. The chairwoman of the committee, a stern woman named Diane, motioned for me to sit. Her voice was calm but cutting. We're here to establish who made what decisions and when during flights 782 and to address any questions surrounding a delayed inheritance issue as it may present a conflict of interest within corporate structure. I felt my stomach twist at the phrasing. They weren't just questioning the flight. They were questioning why the daughter of a vice president wasn't in the will until after she saved 216 people midair. It wasn't justice. It was damage control. But still, I was here. Diane continued. We've received testimony from first Officer Evans, from the captain, Jason Thorne, and from the cabin crew. She paused. But we'd like to begin with a statement from senior flight attendant Cindy Vega. Cindy stood poised, strong. I was near row 10 when the smoke started, she said. I heard Captain Thorne request assistance. Then I saw a woman rise from seat 9A. No panic, no hesitation, just precision. She turned toward me. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She walked straight into the cockpit. That woman, she pointed, corrected the glide path manually. I watched her hands. They were trained. Diane raised an eyebrow. You're certain? I've flown 12 years, Cindy said. I've seen panic. I've seen bluffers. She wasn't either. My father cleared his throat. If I may, this isn't about heroism, he said. This is about chain of command, about protocol, and about who belongs in the cockpit during crisis response. Diane nodded. Of course. Captain Thorne, your thoughts? Jason didn't stand. He sat still, fingers locked, and said only, she was right. For words. No elaboration, no defense. No affection, just a flat confirmation. Too little, too late. I sat still too. I didn't need him to speak louder. His silence these past 3 years had been deafening enough. But today, for the first time, that silence had a consequence. Because Cindy's voice broke through it. Because footage had gone viral. Because I hadn't posted it, but someone else had watched me walk forward and recognized the difference between stepping up and showing off. And now, here we all were in a room built for truth, but used for delay. Still, I said nothing because my silence wasn't surrender. It was testimony. I didn't walk into that courtroom with a folder of claims or a list of demands. No lawyer by my side, no prepared statement, just a truth I wasn't willing to let die unheard. The hearing wasn't about money, at least not to me. It was about the one woman who'd whispered, "The lake is yours." As we watched summer end together, about a voice that had been softened, weakened, and finally extinguished before she could speak for herself, the judge, a short woman with sharp eyes, opened the session with a question I had expected, but still pierced. Miss Thorne, do you wish to contest the will? I stood. No, Your Honor, I'm not here to dispute what was signed. I'm here to ask why it was signed. A murmur rippled through the gallery. My father, seated 2 rows back, stiffened. Jason, expression unreadable, looked straight ahead. The judge leaned forward. Explain. So I did. I told her that my mother had written a letter 2 months before her final hospitalization stating clearly that she wanted me to inherit the lake house, that she had handwritten it, signed it, and asked her nurse to date it. I handed the judge a copy of that letter, not as evidence, but as a voice revived. I know it's not a formal will, I said. No, it doesn't override a signed document drafted by lawyers, but I wanted on record that my mother did know what she wanted and that something changed, not in her heart, but in the pressure placed around it. Jason's knuckles were white against his chair's armrest. The judge examined the letter. Then she looked toward the opposing counsel, seated beside my father's attorney. Do you have a response? The lawyer stood. We maintain the updated will was signed voluntarily, that Mrs. Thorne understood what she was doing. He cleared his throat. We also have video evidence showing her engaging with visitors shortly before the updated document was signed. My heart began to race because I knew what he just stepped into. Judge. Very well. Submit the footage. They did. A BOIFT dimmed the lights. A projector screen was pulled down. What played was grainy, time-stamped, and silent. A wide shot from a security camera above the entrance to room 216 at Willow Oaks Retirement Home. I saw my mother in a wheelchair, blanket over her lap. I saw my father enter, then Jason. For 2 minutes, there was no movement. Then Jason crouched beside her, pulled something from his jacket, a folder. My father leaned in. My mother looked away. Jason slid a pen into her hand. She hesitated, shook her head. My father touched her shoulder, whispered something into her ear. She cried. Eventually, she signed. The room was silent. Even the attorneys didn't breathe. The judge finally said, "Is there audio?" The attorney shook his head. The facility doesn't record sound. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter because we saw enough. We saw my mother resist. We saw pressure applied. We saw a moment not of clarity, but of surrender. I didn't smile. I didn't even look back at my father or brother. I simply said, I'm not here to punish anyone, but I want it known. My mother didn't forget me. Someone just made it easier to erase me. The judge nodded. Once noted, she said, and acknowledged. It wasn't a victory, but it was a restoration. The room was carpeted in that neutral gray blue that corporate offices love, designed to suppress emotion, to make everything seem procedural, but no amount of acoustic paneling or fluorescent politeness could quiet what hung in the air that day. Jason was called to speak. He adjusted the pilot pin on his lapel, cleared his throat, and for a full 5 seconds did nothing but look at the floor. I'm not here today as a captain, he began. Not even as a son. I'm here because I've been wrong for a long time. He looked up, then looked toward me. We lost someone we loved. And instead of honoring her with honesty, I chose silence. I told myself it wasn't my place to question the will. That maybe Rachel didn't need the house or the acknowledgement, or he paused. The word wouldn't come. The seat at the table. There it was. He glanced at the board members of the airline, then back at the committee reviewing the family's estate dispute. But most of all, his eyes lingered where I sat. 3 rows behind him, hands folded in my lap. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't file lawsuits. She didn't go on interviews. What she did do was show up on that plane when no one else could handle the yoke. He took a breath. And I doubted her. Even then, the room was still. Even the AC vents seemed to hush. I called her reckless, Jason continued. I told her she was off the grid for too long, that no one would take her seriously. But the truth is, I wasn't brave enough to admit what I saw in that cockpit. He looked down again, this time not from shame, but from weight. She saved 216 lives, including mine, and I never said thank you. He stepped back from the podium, and that was it. No applause, no gavel, just a slow exhale. From the panel chair, a pause, a nod to the recorder. The meeting moved on. But in me, something stilled. When it ended, I didn't rush out. I waited, not for him, but for the silence to settle. Jason walked over. For the first time in years, he stood in front of me. Not taller, not older, not more decorated. Just Jason. I didn't think you'd come, he said softly. I didn't think you'd speak, I replied. A beat passed. I'm sorry, he said. I studied his face for signs of agenda, of performance, but there was only fatigue and maybe something close to release. I'm not angry anymore, I said, but I am done being invisible. Jason nodded slowly, almost reverently. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded page. I found this. Mom wrote it the same week as the letter you submitted. I think she meant for both of us to read it. He handed it to me. It was a note, just 5 lines. You both have different kinds of wings. Rachel flies with courage. Jason flies with discipline. Neither is lesser. I just hope you land safely together. I smiled. Not at him, not at the words, but at the sudden absence of something I'd carried too long. I don't need the house, I whispered. Jason shook his head. No, but you deserve to choose. I looked past him toward the closed doors. I already did. That's why I sat in row 9A. He frowned slightly. Why that seat? I stood. Because it was near the cockpit. Close enough to help, but far enough to know I wasn't the one flying anymore. He opened his mouth then, closed it, and for the first time, Jason Thorne, captain, eldest, favored, bowed his head, not in defeat, in acknowledgement. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to, because for once I wasn't rising to be seen. I had landed and stayed. I had thought silence was my shield. But after the hearing, it became clear silence had only ever delayed the noise. Within days, my name was trending. Not because I sought recognition, quite the opposite, but because someone somewhere had uploaded the flight roster. And that was all it took. Headlines exploded like fireworks. Across timelines. Mysterious passenger saves 200 plus. Lives midair. Retired military pilot steps in as civilian hero. The woman in 9A, who is Rachel Thorne? Some articles called me modest. Others went further, dubbing me the silent soldier. I didn't read most of them. I couldn't. But I couldn't avoid the comments. Not when they bled into every inbox, every message request, every YouTube reaction. Video my niece accidentally forwarded. She's the real deal. One commentator said, you don't glide a plane through turbulence like that unless you've been in worse. She probably just touched a few buttons. Another sneered. No way a trained pilot would go unnoticed for years. That line stuck with me. No way a trained pilot would go unnoticed for years. As if competency demanded attention. As if worth only counted when displayed. I watched one of the more viral clips, a roundtable podcast. 5 men and 1 woman discussing my existence like it was theoretical. 1 leaned forward dramatically. Let me ask you this. If she's that capable, where's her record? Where are the medals? Why hasn't anyone in the Air Force mentioned her? The woman on the panel calmly responded. Maybe because people like that don't need to prove it. The man rolled his eyes. Man, or maybe it's a fabrication. I'm just saying. Sounds convenient. I turned it off, not out of anger, but because I realized something I hadn't faced until now. Saving 216 lives didn't change the world's habit of doubting women like me. It just made me visible enough to be doubted. And that's what hurt more than anything Jason or my father ever said. Because strangers with no context, no scars, no history were now writing my story louder than I ever had. And the hardest part of me, wanted to respond, to shout, to show the simulator scores, the combat evaluations, the letters of commendation. But the louder part, the trained part, knew better. In flight school, they teach you one thing early. Don't fight the wind. Write it until you're clear. So I logged out, closed the laptop, and for the first time in a long time, let the storm pass without joining it. It started with one message. A woman from Arizona wrote, my mother left everything to my brother. I wasn't even invited to the whole reading, but you reminded me I'm not invisible. Then came another and another. Within a week, my inbox turned into a digital confessional. Stories poured in, not just about flying or inheritance, but about silence, eraser, and the long, slow burn of being disregarded. Women from every corner of the country shared their own versions of the same wound. My father told me business wasn't for girls. I raised 3 siblings while my brother got the house. I sat in every hospital room and still wasn't mentioned in the obituary. No demands, no pity, just recognition. Something was happening that I hadn't expected. My silence had become a frequency, one they could hear clearly, a signal not of pain, but of persistence. Then came the photo. A friend stationed at Ellendorf Air Force Base sent it. A bulletin board in the old training hall. Pinned between flight announcements and weekend schedules was a sign printed in bold Sharpie. She took row 9, but she flew the whole cabin. No name, just the sentence. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I thought I would, because it wasn't about me. Not really. It was about every woman who had taken seat 9A, who'd sat close enough to the controls to act, but far enough from the spotlight to be forgotten. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even redemption. It was proof. Proof that being left off the paper of a will, of a roster, of a family's memory didn't mean you hadn't been there. Didn't mean you hadn't mattered. And for once, I didn't feel alone in that truth. They had tried to erase me, but what they failed to understand was that women like me don't need ink. We become stories. We become signals, and sometimes we become landmarks. Like that sign, bold, unapologetic, unclaimed, but unforgettable. The package came on a Tuesday. No return address, no signature, just my name, handwritten in slanted cursive I hadn't seen in years. Inside was a wooden picture frame, old, but polished, empty. Taped to the back was a folded note, the kind you'd expect from a memory, not a man like my father. I unfolded it slowly. The ink had smudged at the corners, as if it had been held too long before being sent. It said, "Your mother wanted your photo in this frame." I kept it blank. I was wrong to do that. Dad, no apology, no explanations, just that. A sentence. Stripped of pride, of ego, of the man I had once watched take command of entire squadrons like they were chess pieces. And yet this silent admission was heavier than any medal he'd ever pinned to a lapel. I stared at the frame, not at what was in it, but at what wasn't. There was no photograph, no proof of a place already mine. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need it. I didn't need a photo in his frame to prove I was there. I had been there in the cockpit, in the chaos, in the silence after the tribunal. In every second, my name wasn't said, but my actions had spoken louder. It wasn't about him forgetting me anymore. It was about me remembering myself. Not as the daughter, the sister, the ghost in someone else's story, but as Rachel. Just Rachel. The woman who took seat 9A. Not because it was near the cockpit, but because she knew what to do when the cabin shook. The soldier who once walked away from a will, because she no longer needed to inherit what she had already built. And now the person holding an empty frame, knowing that space didn't always need to be filled. Sometimes its emptiness was the message. I placed the frame on my shelf, still blank, still mine. People don't recognize me here, and I like it that way. The sign outside reads R&R Maintenance. A modest hangar on the edge of a small municipal airport. It used to be an old military outpost, now repurposed with grease, torque wrenches, and the occasional sunrise breaking across the steel roof. No medals hang on the walls, no newspaper clippings, no mention of that day at 30,000 feet, the local pilots only know me as Rachel. Sometimes RA, the woman who gets their altimeter synced just right, the one who catches the faint rattle in their rudder before it becomes a problem midair. I once flew jets faster than sound. Now I check bolts and weld hairline cracks before they whisper danger. And somehow this feels braver, because here no one expects anything of me. There are no eyes waiting for me to fail. No father in the corner weighing every move I make. No brother measuring silence with suspicion. There's just work, honest work. Some days I mop the floor. Other days I teach a younger girl how to read a blueprint or calibrate a pressure valve. She doesn't know what I did, only that I'm patient. And that when I say double check everything, I say it like someone who's seen the price of not doing so. I don't correct her when she calls me ma'am. I just smile. In this quiet corner of the world, I found something more lasting than recognition. Purpose. Without the noise. No one here cares what I used to be. And I no longer need them to, because saving lives isn't a title. And surviving truthfully isn't something you hang on a wall. It's something you build every day with your hands, your silence, and your choice to show up again. I didn't work to be seen. I worked because it meant something. And that was always enough. I still remember the curve of the armrest in seat 9A, the smell of stale coffee, the faint hum under my feet before the turbulence hit. It wasn't the worst turbulence I'd ever felt, but it shook something loose inside me. Something that had been bolted down for far too long. When I stood up from that seat, it wasn't an act of heroism. Act of it was survival. Not just for the passengers, but for me. No one called my name. There was no shout from the cockpit, no voice saying, "Rachel, we need you." But I walked. Anyway. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait to be seen. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. All those years of sitting quietly thinking I had to wait for someone to open the door. All those meetings, family dinners, and tribunal hearings where I sat in silence wondering if I was allowed to speak. It took 30,000 feet of altitude and one failing aircraft for me to understand. You don't need an invitation to save what matters. Sometimes you just stand. You just go. That day, I didn't fly the plane because I wanted recognition. I didn't override the system because I needed applause. I did it because I knew how, because I could, and because there were 216 souls behind me who didn't know that I had memorized every glide path. Correction on that model. I walked into that cockpit with hands that had held steel colder than fear and a voice steadier than every man who ever questioned it. I sat down, reached for the controls, and felt the instruments obey. The vibrations softened, the altitude stabilized, and still I didn't look back. I didn't need to. People talk about flight like it's about engines and wings and thrust. But flight, real flight, begins the moment you decide that your name doesn't have to be announced for it to matter. I used to think I needed the world to acknowledge me. But when I stepped out of that cockpit, it was enough that I had acknowledged myself. And now I keep a photo of seat 9A tucked inside my journal. Not because it was special, but because it reminds me where the story changed. I never saw it coming, but it was always there, waiting. That quiet moment where I said, "Not this time. I won't sit still. I won't stay quiet. Not again." I've never spoken to most of the passengers, and that's okay. I don't need thank yous. I don't even need them to remember me because I remember, and that's what matters. Somewhere out there, another woman is sitting in row 9A thinking she has to wait, thinking someone else will step up first. That the world will call her when it's time. I hope she hears this. You don't need to be called. You already know who you are. And one more thing before we say goodbye. Where are you watching this from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly, patiently until you're brave enough to stand up from your seat and walk toward the storm. You won't need a badge. You won't need applause. You'll just need to know. Some heights don't require certification, only the courage to leave the seat you've stayed in too.